welcome to Talk This.
It's dangerous to podcast alone.
I'm your comedy drama host, Madelyn.
I'm your...
First-person life sim.
host Emma. My mind just went blank for a few seconds right there. Don't worry about it.
I'm your in the pause menu host, Emma. And you're tuning in to one of our side quest episodes of Talk This.
Yes.
This week, it's Emma's turn to pick the topic that we're going to discuss for the next length of this episode. So, Emma, don't keep the people in suspense. What's this episode going to be discussing?
Hot suspense. Wow, funny.
Oh, that was funny. Yeah, it was. That wasn't even on purpose. Don't keep these people in Metroidvania.
That doesn't make sense. Get them out of there. Get them out of the Metroidvania. But no, we're talking about genre in video games. What is genre? Why is genre? Why do we use genres in talking about, media, but trying to focus specifically on how we use genre in games. And how does the way we use genre in games differ from how we use genre in other categories? Stuff like that. Freeform genre discussion.
Our specialty. Did anything spark this discussion for you? Or were you just thinking of topics?
I was just thinking of topics. Honestly, there wasn't anything that particularly got me thinking about it. I guess I was thinking a little bit about it. The whole timeline is The Last of Us Part 2 right now, for better or for worse. And I was thinking about how, you'd put The Last of Us Part 2 in the same genre as a lot of games, but that it wouldn't really necessarily tell you anything about either game you were putting into that genre, right? Especially because so much of the criticism about it is that it's, miserable in ways, that, just saying, it's, a action survival horror. And that doesn't even really feel right for The Last of Us.
I don't think horror is right, to be honest.
Survival horror is what people call the first one. I'm not really sure if that's totally accurate. It's because you have limited resources. That's basically what survival horror means.
Okay. Interesting.
That's how the genre is used.
No, I know. I just hearing this game described, when I would think of it as obviously it's some kind of action adventure, hearing it described as a survival horror, I don't think it's necessarily wrong. There are zombies, obviously. Yeah. But it was just interesting. That's all.
Certain parts, at least of the first one, I have yet to play the second one, are more survival horror-y than other parts.
Sure.
Is what I'd say. That wasn't the point.
Sorry.
The point was just that calling something a survival horror doesn't really encompass, the experience of playing that game outside of the fact of, I have to be careful with my resources.
And for what it's worth, Wikipedia, my favorite games resource, has a pretty comprehensive list of video game genres. Their list of video game genres page is very long. But they put survival horror under action-adventure as a subgenre.
Interesting.
So we can both be right.
Guess so.
So, Emma, kick us off. There's so much to discuss here.
I was just thinking about that. I was like, I don't know if every single game that would be survival horror would also be action. But once you go down this rabbit hole, you never come out, which is part of the reason I wanted to talk about it a little bit.
Absolutely.
So speaking of Wikipedia, it informed me that genre was invented by Aristotle in his Poetics, or at least the Western idea of genre was codified by Aristotle in his Poetics, to perhaps put it more accurately. Which I did read in my first year of college, and pretty much remember nothing about it. He like very clearly separates first like poetry, prose, and performance, and then very clearly separates like comedy and tragedy, which I was thinking was funny. I was like, put Aristotle in front of a Yakuza game, and I wonder if he would die.
Aristotle would have a lot of questions. I think that there's a lot that he would have to ask before he dealt with the kind of genre conventions of Yakuza, to be honest.
I was just thinking about how, like, it's, like, what I remember and what Wikipedia was telling me is, like, he was very strict, like, this is what you do in tragedy, and this is what you do in comedy, and they don't cross over. And I was just thinking about Yakuza, and I thought that was hilarious. It just popped in my head.
Pretty funny. I think if somebody tried to dramatize Yakuza for the Greek stage... I mean, again, but fine. Putting aside the what is Japan part of it and what is 1900, I think that there would be a lot of questions. Although, who knows? He has other genre things, as I was reading. Obviously, the epic. Something called the phallic poetry, I think, which I didn't look too much into, to be honest.
Just smut?
I don't know.
The poetry?
I was afraid to look at it, okay. To be honest. But there are a few other, like, lesser-known genres lesser known to me as someone who mostly studied theater.
Right.
But presumably not lesser known if you've studied poetry. That's probably the part of the poetics that you paid attention to if you're a poet. So I recognize that I'm coming at this from a particular angle.
You know, actually thinking about it now, poetry is an interesting example just because, I mean, I guess I don't really know if these are official genres, but there are certain, like, styles of poetry that you would describe within that categorization based on, like, their number of lines and the way they're written versus, like, necessarily about their tone, which I think is more reminiscent of how we use genre in games than, like, how we use genre in books or movies.
Absolutely. So do you want to dive into that? This, like, genre comparison usage? I have thoughts.
Sure. You can go first.
Thanks. So as you kind of raised when we were talking about, or when you were outlining what this episode was going to look like, in games, genre pretty exclusively, with a few notable exceptions, I think, deals with mechanics of the game. So you can have an action-adventure game, you can have a 3D platformer, you can have a life sim, you can have a construction simulator, you can have a JRPG, right? Mm-hmm. And all of those categories tell you, I almost said a lot, tell you a moderate amount about the player experience of the playing experience of the game, and tell you very, very little, again, to varying degrees, about the kind of story content to expect and how to emotions to expect. I think that varies a little bit across some of those. Like, I threw JRPG in there as a genre. I think saying something is a JRPG often tells you about certain genre conventions, about what to expect story-wise as well.
Yeah.
But in many ways, those are often tied to common mechanics.
Yeah.
Right? You expect the merry band of friends doing something in a JRPG just because, like, that's the RPG mechanic, not necessarily because that story gets woven into the mechanic, and that's why it's built into the genre, as opposed to vice versa.
Yeah.
And I thought it was interesting because I was thinking, so, thinking about genre, of course you want to think about ways it's used in other media. And I was thinking, so in movies and TV, I feel like we just have a wider array of terms that we use to talk about genre than we do in games, right? So, the one that I feel like lines up the most, like you were saying, with games is, so we can talk about a film or a television show, like, is it animated? Is it live action? Is it stop motion? Is it a documentary, right? Mm-hmm. Those kinds of things.
Yeah.
And that, I feel like, lines up the most with how we talk about genre in games. Because it's talking about sort of how it was made, like the style of how it was made, basically. Yeah. But then, and in television, I feel like even more pertinently in television, right, we can talk about, like, a single-camera sitcom versus a multi-camera sitcom versus a reality show versus all this kind of stuff. But obviously, in those kinds of media, we also talk about, is something a comedy? Is it a drama? Is it a romance? Is it a crime procedural, right? We have better genres that are way more commonly used than talking about if something like is a multicam sitcom.
Yeah.
That are really story-based. And then we have a whole other kind of subset of what I think of as like the esque genres, which we have in games to some extent too. Like, we might talk about a movie being Tarantino-esque if it's bloody and includes some minor racism and like that kind of thing. I'm just like, I'm sorry, I'm not a big Tarantino.
Yeah, sure.
That was just
they swear a lot.
Just a jab.
Yeah.
They swear a lot. Samuel L. Jackson is in it. You might call it.
You're right.
Tarantino-esque.
That's a prerequisite to being Tarantino-like.
Look, it's part of it, right? So you have that kind of like auteur genre category, right? If it's like a director that you're familiar with, or like to some extent, right? You could talk about like it's like an HBO type show. That's a little less true now than it was maybe 6 or 7 years ago, but still. And then I feel like in movies and television, you have genres that match up with time periods, right? You can talk about like an 80s romantic comedy. I mean, that's pretty similar to talking about it being a John Hughes movie, but whatever, bear with me, right? Mm-hmm. You can talk about it being in the style of 80s romantic comedies, or in the style of like, 30s screwball comedies or something like that. And that's meaningful. And that in particular, I think, is a subset of genre that video games really don't have in quite the same way.
Yeah. I mean, I would say we talk about, one thing is just that, the way that games are now has not been around for as long as the way movies are now has been around. In the grand scale of times, not that much longer, but,
in Aristotle's scale of time.
50 years, 60 years or so can be meaningful in discussions like that. But yeah, I would say like in games you can talk about something being retro style.
Yeah.
But that just means like one span of time and could encompass different eras of retro.
That means it has pixel art.
Yeah.
That's what it means.
Yeah, basically.
So I just thought it was interesting that movies and television in particular, which, for better or for worse, are the media that is most closely compared to games a lot of the time, have like these 4 or 5 different ways that you can come at genre. And while some of these I think are, and not just 4 or 5 different ways that you can come at genre, because I don't think there's any reason we couldn't go into a game and be like, yes, this is a dramatic dark comedy.
Yeah.
But people don't really talk about games that way. So not only are there all of these angles, but they're commonly used in criticism, as opposed to in games, where genre is more or less limited to, at least in my experience, like, are mechanics-based genres. You might see it being, like, compared to an auteur director.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah, and also just, like, even outside discussions, but when you're, like, trying to describe a TV show versus a game to, like, a friend that you're recommending it to, like, you're not saying, oh, yeah, it's this multi-camera sitcom.
Yeah, that's true.
You're saying it's, like, a buddy comedy or whatever.
Yeah.
When you're talking about a TV show, whereas when you're talking about a game, you'd probably say, oh, it's a platformer or something. Which maybe just has to do with the most close way that, or most immediate way that a person perceives the TV show versus the game, based on how they interact with it. But it's interesting just that I just don't use the, like, comedy drama classifications pretty much ever, personally, when I'm talking about games.
Well, I was thinking about it. Are there really any games, aside from, obviously, next week's old game, Mad Funny Borderlands?
I put that into my notes. I was like, they're pretty exclusively described on their mechanics, except for Borderlands in the Mad Funny game genre.
I see that. I see that in your note. That wasn't there before. But even Mad Funny Borderlands, I would hesitate to describe as a comedy.
Oh, yeah.
Even though it is a game that, especially for a certain subset of the gaming public, is really trying to be funny, I would hesitate to describe it as a comedy.
Yeah.
Even though maybe it is? Maybe?
Certainly wears the pizza mask skin of one.
I guess that's true. I think in comedy particularly, though, it's interesting that we talk about games having humor or games having mad jokes or whatever, but we rarely talk about, like, yes, this comedic game, or this game is a comedy. Which maybe has something to do with the fact that, you know, in Borderlands, even if your characters are making, like, funny, profane quips, like, mostly you're killing, like, wraiths or whatever non-PC term. I can't remember what it is, but it's, like, it's bad. Whatever they call them. Psychos. Right?
Yeah.
Like, mostly you're killing desert creatures in Borderlands. Which is, you know, maybe sometimes funny. But is mostly not funny.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not to say it's dramatic. I don't mean to be like, oh, I'm crying over these characters when I play Borderlands, but you know what I mean.
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of it is that, I mean, comedy in particular, I don't know if there are a ton of games that have super mastered the art of humor out there in general. But either way, usually the comedy is somewhat incidental to the other things that are going on in the game. Right? Like, there are funny bits, and funny stuff happens, but the comedy is not necessarily the point.
Yeah. 100% agree.
Yeah. You know, even thinking about, like, I was thinking a little bit about comedy in terms of, like, adventure games or visual novels. Like, Ace Attorney can be very funny. But I wouldn't be like, oh, yes, the comedy game, Ace Attorney.
No, it's a crime procedural.
Yeah, it is. It's just, it's like
CSI game.
Yeah, it kind of is. You're right.
I do think that, well, I was dipping my toes into some of the critical writing, not critical writing, like academic writing. Yes, critical and academic, but academic specific writing about genre in games. And, you know, some of it was a little too dense for me, honestly. But some of it was talking about how this kind of convention of mostly referring to games by mechanic genre harkens back to an era where it would be silly to talk about games in terms of story genre because, like, that doesn't really tell you anything about the game. Right?
Right.
Like, talking about any of the arcade games by story genre would be, like, that would tell you so little about the game in comparison to talking about it as a beat-em-up or talking about it as a, whatever, platformer, right? So that was interesting to me, especially, you know, as we move into this. I mean, goodness knows, most of the discourse about The Last of Us 2 is about the story, right?
Yeah.
I haven't really seen too many people being like, oh my gosh, calling this a survival horror. Like,
survival horror is watching the rope physics and thinking about programming that.
Survival horror is going into the Last of Us 2 hashtag and seeing how far you can get.
You're right, that's a game in itself.
So I do think that, and I do think some of that comes from an important place, right? If you told me about a story of a game, that might make me want to play it, even though it's a type of game that I don't enjoy, or that I'm bad at, which for me are one and the same. But it does feel like in television, right? The reason that you don't talk about how it's shot, although in some cases you do, right? Like, if I was going to tell you about a show that was an anime, I would tell you it was an anime first.
Yeah.
So in some cases you do talk about how it was made, but if we're just restricting ourselves to, like, a live action thing, for the most part, how it was made doesn't make that much of a difference. And so it makes sense then to talk about story genre, because that's mostly what determines whether people are interested in something or not for television or movies or whatever.
Although, you know what sells me on watching, like, a drama show these days?
Like blood and gore,
No,
apparently.
well,
Hannibal.
yes, I am watching Hannibal, and that doesn't fall under this description, but I watched Homecoming specifically because it's 30-minute episodes.
Oh, that's too true.
God, give me half-hour dramas, please. Why is it just a comedy thing? I don't want to watch an hour of television.
I was going to say, no. Like, anime is, but I was like, no, Psycho-Pass is an hour. Like, pretty much all of the drama anime that I have watched, there's not that much.
I mean, also
an hour.
anime, you're right, though. Like, that's part of the reason I was drawn to it, because there's these short, digestible chunks, both in terms of, like, length of shows and length of episodes, which is very, very nice. It's slightly off topic, but I was just thinking about that. TV shows are too long.
Stop it. Or Twitter.
Everything is too long. Give me short things.
Life is too long, Emma.
Oh no, okay. Moving away from that.
I do think games have a few kind of interesting genre quirks that I want to talk about. Aside from, like, this, we don't really talk about them in terms of, like, we would call genre in any other category.
Right.
We don't talk about it in terms of those genres. But I was talking to Click Like Boyfriend a little bit about this. I like to pick his brain before I do side quests, because, I don't know, he's not as, like, steeped in all of this as we are, right? So it's nice to get another perspective. And he was talking about music genre, which he said, like, oh, like, a lot of music has geographic genre traditions.
Sure.
Which at first I was like, oh, games don't have that at all. And I was like, wait a minute. Not quite in the same, like, super specific way that music does. Like, I mean, he was talking about all sorts of, like, metal things that arose somewhere, and I didn't retain it. Sorry. But I was like, oh, yeah, like, Seattle grunge, like, whatever, any of this stuff. But I do think, like our JRPG example, right? If you tell me something that something is a JRPG as opposed to a Western RPG, that does actually tell me something.
Yeah.
So I do think that there is some interesting regional genre distinctions in games that I wasn't at first thinking about, because I was like, oh, game designers are everywhere.
Yeah. I mean, I think you get, you know, when you're raised in a different culture, you make something different, right? So I just think games have, at least in the popular mind, are so focused either in West or Japan that when you're just thinking about it, without, you know, thinking deep into it, that's the only distinction that you make. Whereas you got stuff like Pathologic is made, I think, by a Russian team, which feels correct to the stereotype in my mind. You know? Yeah. Just, you know, sort of dense. In terms of the Russian literature.
Right, you're comparing it to
yeah.
And then I think also games, in a way that, like, movies and TV really don't have, especially anymore. Maybe if you harken back to, like, the studio system days of movies, this was more true. But studio identification, I feel like, oftentimes can serve as an actually pretty useful, at least for people who are kind of semi-steeped in games.
Yeah.
A more of a useful genre identifier than saying it's an action-adventure game.
Yeah.
Right? If you say something, you know, is a Naughty Dog game, or is like a Telltale game, or is like a whatever, pick the identifiable game studio of your choice. That gives you something a little bit more specific to hang on to, and sometimes even gives you story themes that you might want to hang on to. That's obviously true of kind of auteur directors in games as well, right? Saying something is like a Kojima-like game.
Yeah.
Probably tells you something, or saying something is a Nomura type game tells you to stay far away.
That can be a detriment, right? Like, I was thinking as you're saying that about, like, Bethesda, for instance, as a game studio that have made some missteps lately in terms of how they handle certain games. But as soon as you see the Bethesda label on it, even if it's just like published by Bethesda and not developed by Bethesda, you get an automatic, like, knee-jerk, like, uh-oh. Not a Bethesda game.
Yeah. Or, like, EA.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It's like, oh, this will be full of microtransactions.
Yeah.
So that was interesting to me, and in something that I feel like doesn't have an easy parallel, at least in kind of the visibility way that games do. Like, I'm sure that there are certain book publishers or movie studios or whatever that have, like, trademark styles, but I just don't think they're as visible or as, just publicly identifiable as that kind of is in games.
Yeah. I mean, I think the closest thing would be, like, the director of a movie, right? Like, the Tarantino-esque is somewhat similar to, like, the Telltale-esque sort of thing.
I agree, except that games also have enough auteur directors that there's a one-to-one comparison to be made as well.
Ah, yes, but you see, like, Kojima is now just at Kojima Productions.
I know.
So
I mean, of course, he has his own company now. I understand that. But even before he had his own company, I think that would have stood.
True enough.
Or, like, if you say the game is by Yoko Taro,
yeah.
Right? That tells you something about the themes and, like, what the characters' butts are going to look like, to be honest. Like, how much butt there's going to be.
Yeah, that's true.
And then there's a dying genre distinction, at least I think it's dying, right? I think at one point it would have been useful to talk about what console it's on, or if it's on PC, or that kind of thing. And with the exception of, I do think talking about handheld versus not handheld versus mobile is probably still, like, I know it's a mechanical identifier, but I also think it's a genre identifier in a way.
Although handheld outside of mobile is pretty much dead at this point. I don't count the Switch as a handheld device.
Fair enough. Although I do still think that the Switch versus everyone else is maybe the only console distinction that I think is, I mean, and not even in every case, but in some cases is genre-y.
Yeah.
Which might just be because Nintendo is the only company that is really hanging on to true, like, real exclusives.
Yeah.
At this point.
And no sales. Nintendo hates sales.
No sales, yes. That's the genre distinction for Nintendo. Is it still $60?
Always $60.
Oh boy.
I know games are expensive and I should probably be paying more, but every time I'm like, I would buy this Nintendo if you ever put it on sale.
Ever. So, what do you think, Emma? Are you happy with the way we talk about genre in games right now?
I mean, genre is always gonna be a shorthand in anything anyway, right? Like, if you just give someone the genre of anything you're recommending, that doesn't tell them the full experience of it, right? It's just classifying it to give the listener something to hold on to and compare it to, I guess. But I also think that, I don't know, like, at certain points they just do not, like, they're important, they would be important because they mean something, like, something, right?
Yeah.
Like, they're using it so that you can compare it in a meaningful way. But there's some genres out there that are just like, well, I don't know where else to put it. Like, action-adventure is probably the most meaningless genre label out there. Because that's just where I put games where I don't know where else to put them, basically. Like, oh, there's some action and there's some adventure. So, but that's every single game in the universe. So, well, not in the universe, but you understand what I mean.
Well, the problem is that the adventure genre doesn't, I mean, it still exists, but it doesn't exist in the same way as it did, even a decade ago, but really 2 decades ago.
Well, aren't walking simulators the evolution of the adventure genre, though?
I suppose that's true, but those have the name walking simulator.
Yeah, but that's a stupid genre name.
Speaking of stupid genre names, how do you feel about the great Metroidvania debate?
Tell me about it. Tell us about it.
Well, Metroidvania games, as you might suspect if you play games, and would not suspect at all if you do not play games, are a type of platforming game named after Metroid and Castlevania that feature like exploration, generally on kind of 2D maps, a lot of backtracking, puzzles. You get abilities as you go along, those kinds of games. And there was a bunch of writing about how to dumb name, and it's gatekeepy, because nobody knows outside of games what that is. And we should change it to something that's like more accessible and more specific.
I mean, it certainly doesn't mean anything to anybody outside of games. And there's a couple of genre specifications that are named after games. Like roguelike is technically named after a game. From this decade, we now have Soulslikes. And those don't mean anything to anybody who doesn't play games, right? Like, what are you doing in a roguelike or a roguelite? You're sort of a rogue. You like Flynn Rider and Tangled. Is that what that means?
Flynn Rider Simulator.
I mean, that's the image my mind draws up when I think of roguelike, even though that's not what it means. But I mean, that's just, I don't know if that means that you have to change those genre names. I mean, I never use Metroidvania. I just call everything that's a platformer. Regardless of any specifications. And what does platformer to mean to somebody outside of games? That there are platforms? You know?
I think platformer is a little bit easier to parse, but yes.
Sure, it's easier to parse, but once you get into like all of our mechanics-based genre classifications, like you would have to explain those to whoever you're talking about to somebody outside of games anyway, right? Like JRPG even. Like maybe they know RPG, but is someone outside of games going to automatically be like, oh, Japanese? And will they know like the functional difference between like a D&D RPG and what JRPGs typically are? Probably not. If we're using the theoretical person who just knows nothing about any games, you know? So at a certain point it gets to the point where it's like, since we're using genre to talk about mechanics, if we're introducing a game to someone who doesn't play games, you can't use those anyway. That's my opinion on it.
I mean, that's true. And I think the benefit of having genre titles that are game reference is that you can be more specific. Like, I'm thinking of a Soulslike, right? Like a Metroidvania, fine. I can talk about it as being like a, I don't know, backtracking, like a tiered 2D platformer or something, right? Like, I can come up with a way to describe that in pretty few words.
Sure.
And capture that, mostly because the games are so old now, right?
Yeah.
But like a Souls-like, for instance, that not only captures something about the gameplay mechanics, but also carries that, like, this is hard kind of connotation, right?
Yeah.
You wouldn't call something a Souls-like that had all of the mechanics of Dark Souls, but was not hard.
Yeah. I would even say that it gives you something about its tone, Souls-like.
Yeah.
Like, not necessarily its setting. I was going to say setting, but then their most recent game is not medieval Europe anymore. But, like, there's, like, the idea of, like, all these, like, lonely monsters that you have to take up, and the story is more sort of lore-based than necessarily anything as linear as traditional stories. So you're right that Souls-like does encompass like a lot of different things. That just saying like hard, slow action game doesn't really...
Game that you do not have the patience for, Madelyn.
Yeah. Madelyn would not enjoy
Madelyn
this
does not have the patience
game.
or technical ability to complete this game. But on the other hand, so on one hand, it allows you to be much more specific in fewer words in describing a game. However, maybe that's not a good thing, right? Like, if we're putting things into these, like, even more and more specific boxes compared to other games, we might be making comparisons that, I mean, on some level, they're unavoidable, right? If you're making a game that is similar to another game, like Sucks Buddy, it's going to get compared. But you're putting it into these boxes that still are not going to be perfect fits. They're just, like, closer. But might cause comparisons and drive people away from games that are doing new things and that shouldn't be boxed quite that boxily.
Mm-hmm.
So it's tricky. You don't want to have too much specificity in your genres because then we already have a million genres, but then you have a billion genres, and also they're getting really restrictive.
Yeah.
On the other hand, action-adventure doesn't really mean anything.
Yeah. I mean, I think from a discussion point of view, there's that, but I also think that genre labels can have an effect on game designers, too, in that the more conventions that a genre has, and the more, like, people like that, the less encouraged you are to, like, do something different until people stop liking it. You know, I guess that's all media products in general, right? You just keep making the same thing until people don't like it anymore. But I was thinking about that a little bit, too. Like, Final Fantasy is a decent example for me, just because, like, they stuck with, like, the same formula for so long, and then people stopped liking it, and then they released, like, 4 games that, like, were wildly different in style from each other, to try to figure out what people like, and went through, like, this whole period of time where people were like, Square Enix can't make games, or, like, they're, you know, whatever. That they've finally stabilized from with Final Fantasy XIV as it is now, and Final Fantasy VII Remake are... People like the gameplay styles in those, and the narrative to some extent, at least. But like 12, 13, 15 were all pretty controversial when they came out.
Mm-hmm. Why do you think it is that a few kind of emotion-based or story-based genres have kind of broken through in games? I think horror especially is like the main one that does get called out. I was arguing romance a little bit too, although I think that one's a little bit murkier because it gets tied in with some very specific mechanics in a way that horror doesn't.
Yeah, like when you use a term like dating sim, like theoretically that tells you about the genre, but it's also theoretically just a mechanic descriptor. You're simulating dating.
Mm-hmm. But horror, I think has a wide enough array of mechanical choices that people have made, but does still get consistently called out.
Yeah. I mean, I just think that's because it's already kind of like a specific thing, right? Like, you call every genre where you get scared horror.
Yeah.
Or get scared by, you know, monsters or something monstrous, not just, like, suspense movies. But, like, you know, the way that horror games work aren't that, like, the point is to scare you, right? The point is for you to be scared. And so horror still works, I guess, is the closest thing that the player is experiencing.
And I feel like horror is maybe polarizing enough, perhaps, that it gets worth being called out. Like, everybody likes comedy and drama to some extent.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, you might have your tastes about how comedic or how dramatic you prefer your media to be, but, like, I don't think anybody's going to come out and be like, I hate comedy.
I hate all comedies, except for Borderlands, the only mad funny game.
Whereas horror is something that can be kind of polarizing for someone, and like you could describe identical games where one of them is like just has cranked up the scary factor, and it would change people's enjoyment in a way that like cranking up the funny factor probably wouldn't make that much of a difference. Maybe now we're seeing with The Last of Us that cranking up the drama factor might also be something that
I don't know. The Last of Us 2, it's so hard to separate like people who are honestly having that reaction to the game and people who just hate it for other reasons. So I don't know if it's not a game I feel comfortable like making an opinion on until I played it, just because of the way the online discourse is right now.
Yeah, and I'm not trying to express my own opinion here. I'm just saying I'm seeing an inkling here. Maybe it's not genuine, but I'm seeing an inkling here of
I'm sure
saying,
parts of it are genuine, but people are genuine about it. Whatever.
Sure. I'm seeing an inkling here of some people being like, there's too much drama here for me. So it'll be interesting to see where that goes in the next couple of years.
Yeah.
Or, you know, too much tragedy here for me, maybe. Not in the Aristotelian sense, but...
Yeah. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so I think that's part of... Although, again, like, how many genuinely, like, horror games by the status of... By the not status, what am I trying to say? Standards of any other media are there in games, really? Not that many.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like, how many genuinely scary games are there? Come on.
Oh, okay. Madeline, the Fearless.
Not that I play any of them. But...
Come back. Play a few horror games this year and come back to me, okay?
You're right, of course. I know. You know, but like a lot of subgenres of horror, though, I think don't really exist in the same way. Like
sure.
Suspense doesn't really exist in games, not in the same way.
Sure. Give me more Aristotelian tragedy games, TBH.
Yeah, Oedipus the game coming soon.
Yeah, that's what I want. That's what I want out of games next.
I don't think that's what you want. I don't know. The Last of Us 1, maybe. Maybe it's kind of Greek tragic.
Yeah.
Right? You see it? You kind of see it?
Yeah, I see it. Yeah.
I mean, way more zombies. But, you know.
What do you mean? Zombies are a proud tradition of Greek theater.
You're right.
They love zombies.
How did I forget the whole zombie portion of Oedipus Rex? How did I forget that? I don't know what I was thinking.
They talk to dead people in those, probably. There's some, those are zombies. Ghosts are just zombies that don't have bodies,
There you go. There you have it.
The gods are pretty much zombies.
Oh my god.
They die a lot.
You're just digging. You just keep digging.
So, come on, follow me through here. They die a lot, and then they come back, right?
No, they never die. The point is that they never die.
Don't they die in Greek myth sometimes?
No.
No? Okay. Orpheus almost made a zombie, but he couldn't do it.
I wonder if the game Hades is a Greek... I haven't played it. Is it a Greek tragedy? It's not.
I don't know. I haven't played enough of the story. It's a roguelike, yeah. That doesn't necessarily mean it's not a Greek tragedy.
You should write it to them. Be like, have you figured out what your catharsis is going to be? Figured out where your turning point is? They probably have. You know what? They probably have.
They're almost to a full release. They released their last major early access update.
Well, dang. The turning point is coming.
It's coming.
Well, would you want to see any big changes in how we talk about genre? Or are you happy with what we've got?
I mean, I wouldn't mind seeing more descriptions of, like, the drama comedy type put up front. I don't know. In some ways, I wish that they were less forefronted, but I see how they're useful in, like, day-to-day conversation. It just, I think that as games keep going forward, we're either going to have to make more subcategories for them to mean anything, or we're just going to have to give up. You know?
I mean, I was going to say, I don't think there would be anything bad about moving further away from genre, right? In many ways, it's a crutch. It's a useful crutch. I mean, that's what crutches are, right? They're useful. That's kind of the point.
Yeah.
But getting into a habit of discussing things in more depth, right, and not just defaulting to easy labels is probably a good thing for games discussion in general, as opposed to just ending at, yeah, 2D action platformer, that's my stuff.
It's not my stuff.
It's not really I was stringing words together there.
I don't know what kind of game is my stuff.
3D construction horror.
What is that?
It's, like Roller Coaster Tycoon for me.
Oh, yeah. You know, Roller Coaster Tycoon is kind of a horror, except you're playing the monster.
But then you have to sit on your ride.
But
you are the monster and the victim.
It doesn't kill you, though. You just vicariously experience the death of your victims.
You're right. That's true.
You test your coaster of doom to see if it's doomy enough, basically. That's what you do in Roller Coaster Tycoon.
But not a Doom-like, to be clear.
You're right. Doom-like is another genre label that I didn't think of.
Doomy, totally different than a Doom-like. Well, any wrap-up thoughts on genre?
I think loot shooter is a funny word, and we should keep using that one.
Oh, what a great segue. So, listeners, thanks for tuning in to this episode of Talk This.
It's dangerous to podcast alone.
Next week, we'll be discussing potty comedy loot shooter, Borderlands, and another game, Golf. What the Golf?
Yeah.
I came up with both of those on my own.
Wow.
It's a podcast first.
Pretty sure What the Golf is a comedy game of sorts.
It feels like you would not title it that way. If
it was a serious exploration of golf.
I mean,
it could be while still being funny. I haven't played it. I
don't know if there's ever been a dramatic, like a Greek tragic golf game.
The open market. Get in on that.
So yeah, listeners, are you gonna make the Greek tragedy on the holes?
Corner the Oedipus Rex golf game.
It's coming. But listeners, do you have a fantasy genre that you wish that you could put together a Frankenstein's monster of genres that you wish that you would see as a game? I do feel like that's how I would work as a hypothetical game designer, is I would just do like you, with like, when you pick games from the hat, because I'd put a bunch of genres, and I'd be like, oh yeah, like that's where...
I mean, that idea came from my games for business class. We pulled out 2 different games, and then our theoretical game for a theoretical game company had to be a mix of those.
Wow.
Yeah.
Podcast origins right here.
I think ours was some mobile game and Rockstar, because we made like a mobile rhythm game.
Rock band.
What did I say?
Rockstar.
Oh. I think there's probably a Rockstar game, too. It's probably also similar.
Fair enough. Well, anyway, listeners, do you have a Frankenstein's monster genre that you want to see on your screen soon? Do you have ways that you wish genre was used to talk about games that it isn't used, or are you happy with the way it's used? Well, drop us a line on social media. We are on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Talk This Podcast, and we're also on YouTube at Talk This Podcast, so that's probably not the best place to drop us a line. So check us out on all of there for content. Emma's got a video coming to YouTube just in the nearish future.
Sometime this month.
Very exciting.
That's my goal.
Genuinely, though. Sometimes we say that and we don't mean it, but for real.
Yeah, if I dropped this at this point, then I'd have wasted, like, 10 hours of my life, so... better hope that I finish it up.
Excellent. So yeah, follow us on social media for all those kinds of updates. You should also check out our website, www.talkthispodcast.com, where you can read all about the show, see the games that were in the hat that I was talking about, and also check out our blog, where you can read long-running series Clickbait Boyfriend, where my boyfriend is playing action-adventure Disney friendship game, Kingdom Hearts, JRPG, Kingdom Hearts.
But that feels weird to call a JRPG, doesn't it? Because it's also an action game.
It has all the, character menus and stuff.
Yeah, but it's also an action game, isn't it?
Also has Donald Duck.
Has Donald Duck in it.
Yeah.
Is it really just a Donald Duck simulator at the end of the day?
Weigh in on social media, folks. And also, a split screen where Emma and I are watching romantic coffee K-drama, Coffee Prince, and shonen cop simulator, My Hero Academia.
Yeah.
And among other things on the blog. There's always other fun stuff on the blog. It's always a fun little read for when you're inside on a hot summer day. Let's see. Most importantly, you should subscribe to the show. We are on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spotify, Pandora, Overcast, Pocket Cast, anywhere you can find podcasts, you can find Talk This. Next week, as we already said, it's Borderlands and What the Golf, so it's going to be a hilarious episode. You will not want to miss it. It's going to be gangbusters.
Mad funny.
Mad funny. Which is probably going to be the title of the episode.
We really got to track down this teenage boy and ask him for his genre specifiers. I think that Mad Funny is more meaningful than action-adventure.
Mad Funny really does describe Borderlands perfectly.
This man, he's got it all figured out. This teenage boy, he knows.
I haven't been on the subway in months. I'll never
find him.
He
is
the
voice
again.
of the future.
I don't remember what train I was on when I was doing this, so I'm never going to find him.
Missed connections.
Yeah, I know. Can I put that on Craigslist? Sometime in the past year-ish, someone talking about Borderlands on the New York City subway who said it was mad funny. He probably, he would know. He would know. I was going to be like, he wouldn't even know, but he would know.
Yeah.
Maybe I'd get a dozen people being like, that was me. 100 people. Everyone every day.
Mystery genre becomes your life. Which one is the real one who said Mad Funny?
See, and folks, we didn't even need to give you a game mashup this week, and look at that. Emma just made one with my life.
Just a bonus one for all you people who are still here.
Well, Emma, do you want to do our sign-off this week?
This week, I hope the genre of your life becomes a better one than it currently is.